Greetings everyone, hello and welcome to Chiliteracy. Happy Wednesday, I return, I'm back. Not quite back to normal, but I'm back. Hello everybody, how are we all doing? It's lovely to see so many of you here. We've got everyone in, we've got Arian, we've got Lady Mephistopheles. We've got Andy, we've got Parola, we've got Smallcog, we've got Sam, we've got Raytracer, we've got Queek. I think that's everybody. But yes, thank you everybody for whoever resubbed me. Also Raytracer, thank you very much indeed. And also Sam. Yes, your sub is now the same age as you. Maybe rephrase that. But yes, Parola, I hope the pain in the arm gets better. Lady Mephistopheles, I hope the job interview goes well. And yes, I hope your internet at work comes back, Queek, unless you don't want it to come back, in which case, no. It's also the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Oh, Sam has heard that joke so many times already, and he's only like a month into being 42. He's going to get very fed up with it by the end of the year, I can tell you that for nothing. But yes, hello everybody. So yeah, the last few streams have been, well, I didn't stream the first Wednesday of February because I was driving up to North Yorkshire for a friend's mother's funeral. And then I very rudely got into a car crash. Also, hi Amras, welcome. It's a good place to go for a sad reason. Oh, it was. So she and her, well, so her parents live like right next to the North York moors. So yeah, it was a beautiful day. It was genuinely a nice time. Yeah, then I drove back 2 days later. I drove back on the Friday and was an hour away from home when a minibus caught fire on a road, on a fairly main road, a dual carriageway. Smoke suddenly obscured the entire road and everybody just went bang. So I was at the back of a 6-car pileup. Wasn't fun. Would not recommend. So when I said I got into a car crash, it was some car crash. And my car's a write-off, which I'm actually quite glad about because I kind of wanted a new car anyway, but that's not the point. But yeah, basically, I'm so glad the minibus... everybody was fine, by the way, should say that first. Everybody was absolutely fine. I think basically what happened was... so the minibus had pulled over to the side of the road, like off the road, basically on the verge, on the like green bit next to the road, and had put his hazards on. Everybody was kind of slowing down because we were just like, oh, there's something with its hazards on over there, okay. Maybe there's debris on the road, let's just slow down. And then it just went whoosh. And it was smoke bang. Like it was very, very quick. And the poor guy, he obviously got out of his minibus as pretty much as soon as he pulled over because he could smell smoke. He just finished the school run, so there was nobody else on the minibus, which quite frankly is a bit of a miracle. And he couldn't see anything and just heard crunch, 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 which poor guy must have been pretty shocking until he saw people like standing up and walking out of their cars. But the wind must have changed direction or something. Basically the same thing happened on the other side of the carriageway as well. So it was 6 cars involved on my side, and I don't know how many cars, probably around about the same, maybe like 5 on the other side as well, because the smoke just went straight across. And because it was nighttime and it was rainy, it turns out you can't see black smoke against a black sky. So yeah, so that was my Friday a couple of weeks ago. And then, because it was a Friday, turns out nobody works at the weekend, insurance people, etc. So I couldn't do anything for the weekend. And then I was flying to Germany on the Monday, so I had to phone insurance people, which is already a bad time, from Germany. which is a nightmare, because even if you put the correct country code on, the signal's crap. So that was a whole thing, and the police were accidentally, there was a miscommunication. Sorry everybody, you're just getting the story, but I feel like I owe it to you all because I've just disappeared for a few weeks. But basically the police held our vehicles. They were all taken away to a recovery yard. Couldn't tag money, please. Yes, quite. They were all taken away to a recovery yard by the police, and then when I phoned the recovery yard to ascertain the damage of my car, because turns out when you're in that kind of level of crash, your first priority isn't to check your car and take pictures of it and check like who you ran it, like who you hit and who hit you and all that kind of stuff. The priority is get out of the way, there's a bus on fire. Yeah, didn't know who I hit, didn't know who hit anyone else, didn't know the order of the cars, didn't know the damage. So obviously phoning up the recovery yard, probably an important thing to do because you need to ascertain the damage. I was going diameter there, what? And so I phoned up the recovery. Oh, sorry, we can't give you any information on this because the police are investigating at the moment. Oh, okay, right, fine. This seemed to be the case for like the rest of the week. And then I got an email from the police going, basically, oops, whoops, we accidentally held all your vehicles. We didn't mean to do that. There was a miscommunication. You can go and like have a look at them now if you want. It's like, great, fantastic. Thanks for that. But the official police like thing is basically there's no one's fault. No one's really sure what happened. The cars are all a bit marmalised, so nobody really knows who hit who. Just basically sort out your own insurance, which I'm quite glad about because I mean I don't think anybody would have been arsey about it because of the circumstances, but it's quite a relief to just have to sort out my own insurance rather than get an angry person going, well, you rear-ended me. It's like, well, I didn't know you were there until I hit you, so let's not argue about who hit who. Yes, exactly. But I don't exactly know what speed I was going, but my airbags didn't go off, nor did the woman next to me who crashed next to me, who, poor woman, same age as me, had bought her car the week before. So yeah, I really feel for her. She also had a dog in the back of her car, and we were the last two people in the pile-up, so nobody hit her in the back, and the dog was completely fine. Best dog as well. She and I, because our airbags didn't go off, both of us hit our heads on our steering wheels. I hardly hit it at all, didn't even have a mark. She immediately was just like, oh, I feel dizzy and I've got a headache. So we both went and sat down on the side of the road because I immediately had chest pain from my seatbelt, and the fact that I apparently punched the dashboard, which I found out like, I don't know, an hour into the whole thing. I was like, oh, I appear to have bruising on my hand. How did that happen? Yeah, we both sat down next to each other, and her dog, who was called Blue and was a 14-year-old collie, just came and put his head on my knee. It's like, oh, this is the best dog. This is the best dog ever. I love him. And he was the best behaved dog. I mean, collies are clever, and I feel like dogs generally in these kinds of circumstances, dogs are pretty good. If they're like a well-trained dog. But yeah, he was fantastic. But yeah, turns out airbags should go off at like speeds over 10 miles an hour, and I was definitely doing over 10 miles an hour. Yeah, seatbelts are incredible things, but good God, do they hurt. I still can't twist properly. Because I've got like chest and shoulder pain from that. So it was quite entertaining having then to carry cases all the way to Germany and back and try and play trumpet. Wouldn't recommend. It's been a bit of a couple of weeks. I don't have a Citroen. No, I have mine's a VW. Was a VW up. So tiny car. Not surprised it's totaled. Your brother blew his airbags bumping into a trash can. Well, that's the thing. They're meant to go at like the slightest provocation, and every car in front of us two at the back, their airbags had gone off, but ours, yeah, mine and the woman next to me, our airbags didn't. Which, for someone who had just bought their car, I'm assuming second hand, but still had just bought their car, that's not great. Yeah. Wouldn't recommend. Extra good thing I had my seatbelt on then. Yeah, well, I mean, I was on a dual carriageway. I wasn't not going to have my seatbelt on. But, yeah. My immediate thought was just like, let's check my fingers and my lips, because those are the things I need for playing. Yeah. But it was quite funny, actually, because it's amazing what muscle memory does. Because I crashed, therefore stopped, was stationary, and went, I've parked. So I put my handbrake on, put my car in neutral, and took my keys out. I was just looking back at it, it's like, wow, I really just did that. Okay, sure. And then sort of sat there for a couple of seconds thinking, should I get out? And then it was like, well, the car in front of me is starting to smoke. Maybe I should let's get out. So I got out. And then obviously they were checking us because the firefighters arrived in frankly record time. It was quite amazing. If there's smoke everywhere, probably yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Also, I assume it was an electrical fire. I'm not sure, but it stank. And the minibus was a complete shell at the end. But anyway, the firefighters arrived very quickly. Obviously checked everybody who was saying that they were feeling any kind of, discomfort or anything. So checked my vitals and checked the woman next to me's vitals. And everybody else's heart rate was like, just under 100, like 97. Mine was 88. And they were like, you're stressed, right? And I was like, well, I think so. It's like, that's kind of weird. It's like, is it? Okay. So my immediate thought is, I guess because I'm used to stressful situations as a musician, I was just weirdly chill. Yeah, maybe being a performer helps. I think so. And also my immediate response to, I've got chest pain was, I should take some deep breaths to check that I can breathe normally and like nothing's like, I don't know, impeding my breathing. So I took a few deep breaths and that probably helped, calm things down as well. But yeah, it's quite amazing actually what happens, what adrenaline does, or what just your body does and your brain does in that situation. It's like, well, the worst thing has happened now, which is me crashing. I'm fine. Everybody else is fine. I just need to get away from the fire and then everything's fine. Apart from the fact that it was like -1 degree, it was very unpleasant and it was wet. Do I have a resting heart rate of a 90-year-old woman? I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I have a resting heart rate of a vampire. Who knows? But yes. But now I've got to buy a new car, which is going to be fun. You're sort of the same. You have anxiety and will spiral for the littlest thing, but faced with actual danger, you're weirdly calm. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Is like, I guess now I know what I'm like in an actual crisis. It's been awfully cold lately. This is your takeaway from this crash in summer. Yeah, absolutely. Crash in summer, preferably not at night time either, because cold. But yeah, it's a good skill to have. Well, yeah, I'm not sure it's a skill, but I think I would have been a lot more stressed had there been an instrument in the car, because there wasn't anything valuable in my car, and I think I would have been a little more stressed if a trumpet had been in the back, say. But don't crash when it's 35 degrees. No, absolutely not. Yeah, I hope the next car has better airbags too. Yes, I won't go for a VW up again. Not that I went for it in the first place. It was a hand-me-down. But yeah. Anyway, so that's one story for tonight of why I haven't been around for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, and turns out dealing with insurers, they, thank you for listening. Exactly, they just do not care. They do not care. I was like, oh, yeah, now telling the new text at the top of chat, yeah. Yeah, it was like saying that I was in a 6-car pileup. They're like, okay, can you tell me the details of all the cars? And it's like, hi, this is like, not, sorry to hear you've been in a crash, not, I'm glad you're okay, not, I'm going to treat you like a human being just for, one sentence. No, none of that. So I've decided that insurance companies are monsters. I say I've decided that. I feel like it's just a normal thing. Your brother's car caught on fire. Jeez Louise. End of last year, the insurance company was pricing quick. Yeah. Was it an electric car, out of interest? Because I remember the firefighters were very quick to check like which of the cars were electric. And obviously had to be very careful about those. Yeah. Anyway, I've decided that the book I'm going to start is sort of off-brand Dickens, basically. Anthony Trollope is known for a similar kind of thing in terms of vibe to Dickens, and Barchester Towers is kind of one of his most famous books. Tony Trollope, that's good, like it. And Renner McGann also tripped electrics, but beside the car, nothing and no one else was hurt. Well, good. I'm glad. But yes, I don't really know much about Barchester Towers. I'm kind of going in here blind, but I have been told several thousand times by both of my parents, who are usually pretty good for book recommendations, that this is a good read and quite fun. It's also got the fabulously named Obadiah Slope in it. Any guesses whether he is a good guy or a bad guy? Similar idea again to Dickens. It's like, I'm going to name people like depending on their personality. Surprised Automod is letting Trollope through. I think it's because it's got an E on the end. I think if you had Trollope without the E, it might not do it. I don't know, because it's calling someone a Trollope is without the E. So I don't know. It's a damn good name though. So can we call him a Trollope? We can call him a Trollope. Yay! Hooray! There we go then. Obadiah is just a villain's name. Exactly. Also, this one does what, again, a lot of kind of Dickens and that era books do, and just randomly blanks out, years or names, which is very unhelpful. So I might just fill them in with, I don't know, just random numbers or random names. Oh, you looked up why they do that the other day. Why do they do that? Oh, inconclusive. Well, that's great. Your new go-to insult for Twitch? Yes. You Trollope. Trollope and Strumpet. Both good names. But, seemingly to try and make it a bit more timeless. Okay. Yeah, but when you're reading them out loud, it's kind of impossible. Anyway, we shall see how far we get through this tonight, because I'm still in some level of discomfort and pain, because one thing I will say, I actually drove for the first time since the crash yesterday, because I'm insured on my mum's car, which I haven't driven for a while, but it's a car that I've driven a lot, so I know it. And I drove in the dark yesterday. I was stressed as hell, but I did it, and I felt better when I was driving back. So I know people say, like, you should get behind the wheel as quickly as possible after a crash, just to make sure that you don't have some kind of, aversion to it. But we'll say, turns out, when you hurt yourself in a particular position, aka driving, getting back into that position and, moving a wheel around, actually hurts. So, might still have to wait a little bit before driving a lot. But we shall see. Anyway, right, enough yapping about car crashes and stuff. Let us begin. Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 1. Who will be the new bishop? In the latter days of July in the year 1850, a most important question was for 10 days hourly asked in the cathedral city of Barchester, and answered every hour in various ways. Who was to be the new bishop? The death of old Dr. Grantley, who had for many years filled that chair with meek authority, took place exactly as the ministry of Lord So-and-so was going to give place to that of Lord So-and-so. The illness of the good old man was long and lingering, and it became at last a matter of intense interest to those concerned whether the new appointment should be made by a Conservative or Liberal government. It was pretty well understood that the outgoing Premier had made his selection, and that if the question rested with him, the mitre would descend on the head of Archdeacon Grantley, the old bishop's son. The Archdeacon had long managed the affairs of the diocese, and for some months previous to the demise of his father, rumour had confidently assigned to him the reversion of his father's honours. Bishop Grantley died as he had lived, peaceably, slowly, without pain and without excitement. The breath ebbed from him almost imperceptibly, and for a month before his death it was a question whether he were alive or dead. A trying time was this for the Archdeacon, for whom was designed the reversion of his father's see by those who then had the giving away of episcopal thrones. I would not be understood to say that the Prime Minister had in so many words promised the bishopric to Dr. Grantley. He was too discreet a man for that. There is a proverb with reference to the killing of cats, and those who know anything either of high or low government places will be well aware that a promise may be made without positive words, and that an expectant may be put into the highest state of encouragement, though the great man on whose breath he hangs may have done no more than whisper that Mr. So-and-so is certainly a rising man. Such a whisper had been made, and was known by those who heard it to signify that the cures of the diocese of Barchester should not be taken out of the hands of the Archdeacon. The then Prime Minister was all in all at Oxford, and had lately passed a night at the house of the Master of Lazarus. Now, the Master of Lazarus, which is, by the by, in many respects the most comfortable as well as the richest college in Oxford, was the Archdeacon's most intimate friend and most trusted counsellor. On the occasion of the Prime Minister's visit, Dr. Grantley was of course present, and the meeting was very gracious. On the following morning, Dr. Gwynne, the master, told the Archdeacon that in his opinion the thing was settled. At this time the bishop was quite on his last legs, but the ministry also were tottering. Dr. Grantley returned from Oxford happy and elated, to resume his place in the palace, and to continue to perform for the father the last duties of a son, which, to give him his due, he performed with more tender care than was to be expected from his usual somewhat worldly manners. A month since the physicians had named 4 weeks as the outside period during which breath could be supported within the body of the dying man. At the end of the month, the physicians wondered and named another fortnight. The old man lived on wine alone, but at the end of the fortnight he still lived, and the tidings of the fall of the ministry became more frequent. Sir Lambda Muniu and Sir Omicron Pye, the 2 great London doctors, now came down for the 5th time, and declared, shaking their learned heads, that another week of life was impossible, and as they sat down to lunch in the episcopal dining-room, whispered to the Archdeacon their own private knowledge that the ministry must fall within 5 days. The son returned to his father's room, and after administering with his own hands the sustaining modicum of Madeira, sat down by the bedside to calculate his chances. The ministry were to be out within 5 days. His father was to be dead within... No, he rejected that view of the subject. The The ministry were to be out, and the diocese might probably be vacant at the same period. There was much doubt as to the names of the men who were to succeed to power, and a week must elapse before a cabinet was formed. Would not vacancies be filled by the outgoing men during this week? Dr. Grantley had a kind of idea that such would be the case, but did not know. And then he wondered at his own ignorance on such a question. He tried to keep his mind away from the subject, but he could not. The race was so very close, and the stakes were so very high. He then looked at the dying... He then looked at the dying man's impassive, placid face. There was no sign there of death or disease. It was something thinner than of yore, somewhat greyer, and the deep lines of age more marked. But, as far as he could judge, life might yet hang there for weeks to come. Sir Lambda Mu and Sir Omicron Pi had thrice been wrong, and might yet be wrong thrice again. The old bishop slept during 20 of the 24 hours, but during the short periods of his waking moments he knew both his son and his dear old friend Mr. Harding, the Archdeacon's father-in-law, and would thank them tenderly for their care and love. Now he lay sleeping like a baby, resting easily on his back, his mouth just open, and his few grey hairs straggling from beneath his cap. His breath was perfectly noiseless, and his thin one hand, which lay above the coverlid, never moved. Nothing could be easier than the old man's passage from this world to the next. But by no means easy were the emotions to him who sat there watching. He knew it must be now or never. He was already over 50, and there was little chance that his friends who were now leaving office would soon return to it. No probable British Prime Minister but he who was now in, he who was so soon to be out, would think of making a bishop of Dr. Grantley. Thus he thought, long and sadly, in deep silence, then gazed at that still living face, and then at last dared to ask himself whether he really longed for his father's death. The effort was a salutary one, and the question was answered in a moment. The proud, wishful, worldly man sank on his knees by the bedside, and, taking the bishop's hand within his own, prayed eagerly that his sins might be forgiven him. His face was still buried in the clothes when the door of the bedroom opened noiselessly, and Mr. Harding entered with a velvet step. Mr. Harding's attendance at that bedside had been nearly as constant as that of the Archdeacon, and his ingress and egress was as much a matter of course as that of his son-in-law. He was standing close beside the Archdeacon before he was perceived, and would also have knelt in prayer had he not feared that his doing so might have caused some sudden start and have disturbed the dying man. Dr. Grantley, however, instantly perceived him, and rose from his knees. As he did so, Mr. Harding took both his hands and pressed them warmly. There was more fellowship between them at that moment than there had ever been before, and it so happened that after circumstances greatly preserved the feeling. As they stood there pressing each other's hands, the tears rolled freely down their cheeks. "God bless you, my dears," said the bishop with feeble voice as he woke. "God bless you. May God bless you both, my dear children." And so he died. There was no loud rattle in the throat, no dreadful struggle, no palpable sign of death, but the lower jaw fell a little from its place, and the eyes, which had been so constantly closed in sleep, now remained fixed and open. Neither Mr. Harding nor Dr. Grantley knew that life was gone, though both suspected it. "I believe it's all over," said Mr. Harding, still pressing the other's hands. "I think, nay, I hope it is." "I will ring the bell," said the other, speaking all but in a whisper. "Mrs. Phillips should be here." Mrs. Phillips, the nurse, was soon in the room, and immediately, with practised hand, closed those staring eyes. "It's all over, Mrs. Phillips?" asked Mr. Harding. My lord's no more," said Mrs. Phillips, turning round and curtsying low. Turning round and curtsying low with solemn face. "His lordship's gone more like a sleeping babby than any that I ever saw." "It's a great relief, Archdeacon," said Mr. Harding. "A great relief. Dear, good, excellent old man. Oh, that our last moments may be as innocent and as peaceful as his." "Surely," said Mrs. Phillips, "the Lord be praised for all his mercies. But for a meek, mild, gentle-spoken Christian, his lordship was—" And Mrs. Phillips, with unaffected but easy grief, put up her white apron to her flowing eyes. "You cannot but rejoice that it is over," said Mr. Harding, still consoling his friend. The Archdeacon's mind, however, had already travelled from the death-chamber to the closet of the Prime Minister. He had brought himself to pray for his father's life, but now that that life was done, minutes were too precious to be lost. It was now useless to dally with the fact of the bishop's death, useless to lose perhaps everything for the pretence of a foolish sentiment. But how was he to act while his father-in-law stood there holding his hand? How, without appearing unfeeling, was he to forget his father in the bishop, to overlook what he had lost and think only of what he might possibly gain? "No, I suppose not," said he at last, in answer to Mr. Harding. "We have all expected it so long." Mr. Harding took him by the arm and led him from the room. "We will see him again tomorrow morning," said he. "We had better leave the room now to the women." And so they went downstairs. It was already evening and nearly dark. It was most important that the Prime Minister should know that night that the diocese was vacant. Everything might depend on it. And so, in answer to Mr. Harding's further consolation, the Archdeacon suggested that a telegraph message should be immediately sent off to London. Mr. Harding, who had really been somewhat surprised to find Dr. Grantley, as he thought, so much affected, was rather taken aback, but he made no objection. He knew that the Archdeacon had some hope of succeeding to his father's place, though he by no means knew how highly raised that hope had been. "Yes," said Dr. Grantley, collecting himself and shaking off his weakness. "We must send a message at once. We don't know what might be the consequence of delay. Will you do it?" "Oh, yes, certainly. I'll do anything. Only I don't know exactly what it is you want." Dr. Grantley sat down before a writing table, and taking pen and ink, wrote on a slip of paper as follows: "By electric telegraph. For the Earl of so-and-so, Downing Street or elsewhere. The Bishop of Barchester is dead. Message sent by the Reverend Septimus Harding." "There," said he. "Just take that to the telegraph office at the railway station and give it in as it is. They'll probably make you copy it onto one of their own slips. That's all you'll have to do. Then you'll have to pay them £0.50." And the Archdeacon put his hand in his pocket and pulled out the necessary sum. Mr. Harding felt very much like an errand boy, and also felt that he was called on to perform his duties as such at rather an unseemly time. But he said nothing, and took the slip of paper and the proffered coin. "But you've put my name into it, Archdeacon." "Yes," said the other. "There should be the name of some clergyman, you know, and what name so proper as that of so old a friend as yourself? The Earl won't look at the name, you may be sure of that. But, my dear Mr. Harding, pray don't lose any time." Mr. Harding got as far as the library door on his way to the station, when he suddenly remembered the news with which he was fraught when he entered the poor bishop's bedroom. He had found the moment so inopportune for any mundane tidings that he had repressed the words which were on his tongue, and immediately afterwards all recollection of the circumstance was for the time banished by the scene which had occurred. "But, Archdeacon," said he, turning back, "I forgot to tell you. The ministry are out." "Out?" exclaimed the Archdeacon, in a tone which too plainly showed his anxiety and dismay, although under the circumstances of the moment he endeavoured to control himself. "Out? Who told you so?" Mr. Harding explained that news to this effect had come down by electric telegraph, and that the tidings had been left at the palace door by Mr. Chadwick. The Archdeacon sat silent for a while, meditating, and Mr. Harding stood looking at him. "Never mind," said the Archdeacon at last. "Send the message all the same. The news must be sent to someone, and there is at present no one else in a position to receive it. Do it at once, my dear friend. You know I would not trouble you were I in a state to do it myself. A few minutes' time is of the greatest importance." Mr. Harding went out and sent the message, and it may be as well that we should follow it to its destination. Within 30 minutes of its leaving Barchester, it reached the Earl of So-and-so in his inner library. What elaborate letters, what eloquent appeals, what indignant remonstrances he might there have to frame at such a moment may be conceived, but not described. How he was preparing his thunder for successful rivals, standing like a British peer with his back to the sea-coal fire and his hands in his breeches pockets. How his fine eye was lit up with anger, and his forehead gleamed with patriotism. How he stamped his foot as he thought of his heavy associates. How he all but swore as he remembered how much too clever one of them had been. My creative readers may imagine. But was he so engaged? No. History and truth compel me to deny it. He was sitting easily in a lounging chair, conning over a Newmarket list, and by his elbow on the table was lying open an uncut French novel on which he was engaged. He opened the cover in which the message was enclosed, and having read it, he took his pen and wrote on the back of it, "For the Earl of So-and-so, with the Earl and So-and-so's compliments," and sent it off again on its journey. Thus terminated our unfortunate friend's chance of possessing the glories of a bishopric. The names of many divines were given in the papers as that of the bishop-elect. The British grandmother declared that Dr. Gwynne was to be the man, in compliment to the late ministry. This was a heavy blow to Dr. Grantley, but he was not doomed to see himself superseded by his friend. The Anglican devotee put forward confidently the claims of a great London preacher of austere doctrines, and the Eastern Hemisphere, an evening paper supposed to possess much official knowledge, declared in favour of an eminent naturalist, a gentleman most completely versed in the knowledge of rocks and minerals, but supposed by many to hold on religious subjects no special doctrines whatever. The Jupiter, that daily paper which, as we all know, is the only true source of infallibly correct information on all subjects, for a while was silent, but at last spoke out. The merits of all these candidates were discussed and somewhat irreverently disposed of, and then the Jupiter declared that Dr. Proudie was to be the man. Dr. Proudie was the man. Just a month after the demise of the late bishop, Dr. Proudie kissed the Queen's hand as his successor-elect. We must beg to be allowed to draw a curtain over the sorrows of the Archdeacon as he sat, sombre and sad at heart, in the study of his parsonage at Plumstead Episcopi. On the day subsequent to the dispatch of the message he had heard that the Earl of so-and-so had consented to undertake the formation of a ministry, and from that moment he knew that his chance was over. Many will think that he was wicked to grieve for the loss of episcopal power, wicked to have coveted it, nay, wicked to even have thought about it, in the way and at the moments he had done so. With such censures I cannot profess that I completely agree. The nullo episcopari, though still in use, is so directly at variance with the tendency of all human wishes that it cannot be thought to express the true aspirations of rising priests in the Church of England. A lawyer does not sin in seeking to be a judge, or in compassing his wishes by all honest means. A young diplomat entertains a fair ambition when he looks forward to be the lord of a first-rate embassy, and a poor novelist when he attempts to rival Dickens or rise above Fitzjames commits no fault, though he may be foolish. Sidney Smith truly said that in these recreant days we cannot expect to find the majesty of St. Paul beneath the cassock of a curate. If we look to our clergymen to be more than men, we shall probably teach ourselves to think that they are less, and can hardly hope to raise the character of the pastor by denying to him the right to entertain the aspirations of a man. Our archdeacon was worldly. Who among us is not so? He was ambitious. Who among us is ashamed to own that last infirmity of noble minds? He was avaricious, my readers will say. No, it was for no love of lucre that he wished to be Bishop of Barchester. He was his father's only child, and his father had left him great wealth. His preferment brought him in nearly 3,000 a year. The bishopric, as cut down by the Ecclesiastical Commission, was only 5. He would be a richer man as archdeacon than he could be as bishop. But he certainly did desire to play first fiddle. He did desire to sit in full lawn sleeves among the peers of the realm, and he did desire, if the truth must out, to be called my lord by his reverend brethren. His hopes, however, were they innocent or sinful, were not fated to be realised, and Dr. Proudie was consecrated Bishop of Barchester. Chapter 2. Hiram's Hospital according to Act of Parliament. It is hardly necessary that I should here give to the public any lengthened biography of Mr. Harding up to the period of the commencement of this tale. The public cannot have forgotten how ill that sensitive gentleman bore the attack that was made on him in the columns of the Jupiter, with reference to the income which he received as warden of Hiram's Hospital in the city of Barchester. Nor can it yet be forgotten that a lawsuit was instituted against him on the matter of that charity by Mr. John Bold, who afterwards married his, Mr. Harding's, younger and then only unmarried daughter. Under pressure of these attacks, Mr. Harding had resigned his wardenship, though strongly recommended to abstain from doing so, both by his friends and by his lawyers. He did, however, resign it, and betook himself manfully to the duties of the small parish of St. Cuthbert's, in the city, of which he was vicar, continuing also to perform those of precentor of the cathedral, a situation of small emolument which had hitherto been supposed to be joined, as a matter of course, to the wardenship of the hospital above spoken of. When he left the hospital from which he had been so ruthlessly driven, and settled himself down in his own modest manner in the High Street of Barchester, he had not expected that others would make more fuss about it than he was inclined to do himself, and the extent of his hope was that the movement might have been made in time to prevent any further paragraphs in the Jupiter. His affairs, however, were not allowed to subside thus quietly, and people were quite as much inclined to talk about the disinterested sacrifice he had made as they had before been to upbraid him for his cupidity. The most remarkable thing that occurred was the receipt of an autograph letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury, in which the primate very warmly praised his conduct, and begged to know what his intentions were for the future. Mr. Harding replied that he intended to be rector of St. Cuthbert's in Barchester, and so the matter dropped. Then the newspapers took up his case, the Jupiter among the rest, and wafted his name in eulogistic strains through every reading-room in the nation. It was discovered also that he was the author of that great musical work, Harding's Church Music, and a new edition was spoken of, though, I believe, never printed. It is, however, certain that the work was introduced into the Royal Chapel at St. James's, and that a long criticism appeared in the Musical Scrutator, declaring that in no previous work of the kind had so much research been joined with such exalted musical ability, and asserting that the name of Harding would henceforward be known wherever the arts were cultivated or religion valued. This was high praise, and I will not deny that Mr. Harding was gratified by such flattery, for if Mr. Harding was vain on any subject, it was on that of music. But here the matter rested. The second edition, if printed, was never purchased. The copies which had been introduced into the Royal Chapel disappeared again, and were laid by in peace, with a load of similar literature. Mr. Towers, of the Jupiter, and his brethren occupied themselves with other names, and the undying fame promised to our friend was clearly intended to be posthumous. Mr. Harding had spent much of his time with his friend the bishop, much with his daughter Mrs. Bold, now, alas, a widow, and had almost daily visited the wretched remnant of his former subjects, the few surviving bedesmen now left at Hiram's Hospital. 6 of them were still living. 6 of them were still living. The number, according to old Hiram's will, should always have been 12. But after the abdication of their warden, the bishop had appointed no successor to him. No occupants of the charity had been nominated, and it appeared as though the hospital at Barchester would fall into abeyance, unless the powers that be should take some steps towards putting it once more into working order. During the past 5 years, the powers that be had not overlooked Barchester Hospital, and sundry political doctors had taken the matter in hand. Shortly after Mr. Harding's resignation, the Jupiter had very clearly shown what ought to be done. In about half a column it had distributed the income, rebuilt the building, put an end to all bickerings, regenerated kindly feeling, provided for Mr. Harding, and placed the whole thing on a footing which could not but be satisfactory to the city and Bishop of Barchester, and to the nation at large. The wisdom of this scheme was testified by the number of letters which Common Sense, Veritas, and One That Loves Fair Play sent to the Jupiter, all expressing admiration, and amplifying on the details given. It is singular enough that no adverse letter appeared at all, and therefore none, of course, was written. But Cassandra was not believed, and even the wisdom of the Jupiter sometimes falls on deaf ears. Though other plans did not put themselves forward in the columns of the Jupiter, reformers of church charities were not slack to make known in various places their different nostrums for setting Hiram's Hospital on its feet again. A learned bishop took occasion in the upper house to allude to the matter, intimating that he had communicated on the subject with his right reverend brother of Barchester. The Radical member for Stalybridge had suggested that the funds should be alienated for the education of the agricultural poor of the country, and he amused the House by some anecdotes touching the superstition and habits of the agriculturalists in question. A political pamphleteer had produced a few dozen pages, which he called "Who are John Hiram's Heirs?", intending to give an infallible rule for the governance of all such establishments, and at last a member of the government promised that in the next session a short bill should be introduced for regulating the affairs of Barchester and other kindred concerns. The next session came, and, contrary to customs, the bill came also. Men's minds were then intent on other things. The first threatenings of a huge war hung heavily over the nation, and the question as to Hiram's heirs did not appear to interest very many people, either in or out of the House. The bill, however, was read and re-read, and in some undistinguished manner was passed through its 11 stages without appeal or dissent. What would John Hiram have said in the matter could he have predicted that some 45 gentlemen would take on themselves to make a law altering the whole purport of his will, without in the least knowing at the moment of their making it what it was that they were doing? It is, however, to be hoped that the Under-Secretary for the Home Office knew, for to him had the matter been confided. The bill, however, did pass, and at the time at which this history is supposed to commence, it had been ordained that there should be, as heretofore, 12 old men in Barchester Hospital, each with 1 shilling 4 pence a day, that there should also be 12 old women to be located in a house to be built, each with 1 shilling 2 pence a day, and that there should be a matron with a house and £70 a year, a steward with £150 a year, and latterly a warden with £450 a year, who should have the spiritual guidance of both establishments, and the temporal guidance of that appertaining to the male sex. The bishop, dean, and warden were, as formerly, to appoint in turn the recipients of the charity, and the bishop was to appoint the officers. There was nothing said as to the wardenship being held by the precentor of the cathedral, nor a word as to Mr. Harding's right to the situation. It was not, however, till some months after the death of the old bishop, and almost immediately consequent on the installation of his successor, that notice was given that the reform was about to be carried out. The new law and the new bishop were among the earliest works of a new ministry, or rather of a ministry who, having for a while given place to their opponents, had then returned to power, and the death of Dr. Grantley occurred, as we have seen, exactly at the period of the change. Poor Eleanor Bold! How well does that widow's cap become her, and the solemn gravity with which she devotes herself to her new duties. Poor Eleanor! Poor Eleanor! I cannot say that with me John Bold was ever a favourite. I never thought him worthy of the wife he had won. But in her estimation he was most worthy. Hers was one of those feminine hearts which cling to a husband, not with idolatry, for worship can admit of no defect in its idol, but with the perfect tenacity of ivy. As the parasite plant will follow even the defects of the trunk which it embraces, so did Eleanor cling to and love the very faults of her husband. She had once declared that whatever her father did should in her eyes be right. She then transferred her allegiance and became ever ready to defend the worst failings of her lord and master. And John Bold was a man to be loved by a woman. He was himself affectionate. He was confiding and manly, and that arrogance of thought, unsustained by first-rate abilities, that attempt at being better than his neighbours, which jarred so painfully on the feelings of his acquaintance, did not injure him in the estimation of his wife. Could she even have admitted that he had a fault, his early death would have blotted out the memory of it. She wept as for the loss of the most perfect treasure with which mortal woman had ever been endowed. For weeks after he was gone, the idea of future happiness in this world was hateful to her. Consolation, as it is called, was insupportable, and tears and sleep were her only relief. But God tempers the wind to the shorn lamb. She knew that she had within her the living source of other cares. She knew that there was to be created for her another subject of weal or woe, of unutterable joy or despairing sorrow, as God in his mercy might vouchsafe to her. At first this did but augment her grief. To be the mother of a poor infant, orphaned before it was born, brought forth to the sorrows of an ever desolate hearth, nurtured amidst tears and wailing, and then turned adrift into the world without the aid of a father's care. There was at first no joy in this. By degrees, however, her heart became anxious for another object, and, before its birth, the stranger was expected with all the eagerness of a longing mother. Just 8 months after the father's death, a second John Bold was born. And if the worship of one creature can be innocent in another, let us hope that the adoration offered over the cradle of the fatherless infant may not be imputed as a sin. It will not be worth our while to define the character of the child, or to point out in how far the faults of the father were redeemed within that little breast by the virtues of the mother. The baby, as a baby, was all that was delightful, and I cannot foresee that it will be necessary for us to inquire into the facts of his after life. Our present business at Barchester will not occupy us above a year or 2 at the farthest, and I will leave it to some other pen to produce, if necessary, the biography of John Bold the younger. But, as a baby, this baby was all that could be desired. This fact no one attempted to deny. "Is he not delightful?" she would say to her father, looking up into his face from her knees, her lustrous eyes overflowing with soft tears, her young face encircled by her close widow's cap, and her hands on each side of the cradle in which her treasure was sleeping. The grandfather would gladly admit that the treasure was delightful, and the uncle archdeacon himself would agree, and Mrs. Grantley, Eleanor's sister, would re-echo the word with true sisterly energy, and Mary Bold. But Mary Bold was a second worshipper at the same shrine. The baby was really delightful. He took his food with a will, stuck out his toes merrily whenever his legs were uncovered, and did not have fits. These are supposed to be the strongest points of baby perfection, and in all these our baby excelled. And thus the widow's deep grief was softened, and a sweet balm was poured into the wound which she had thought nothing but death could heal. How much kinder is God to us than we are willing to be to ourselves. At the loss of every dear face, at the last going of every well-beloved one, we all doom ourselves to an eternity of sorrow, and look to waste ourselves away in an ever-running fountain of tears. How seldom does such grief endure! How blessed is the goodness which forbids it to do so! "Let me ever remember my living friends, but forget them as soon as dead," was the prayer of a wise man who understood the mercy of God. Few, perhaps, would have the courage to express such a wish, and yet to do so would only be to ask for that release from sorrow which a kind Creator almost always extends to us. I would not, however, have it imagined that Mrs. Bold forgot her husband. She daily thought of him with all conjugal love, and enshrined his memory in the innermost centre of her heart. But yet she was happy in her baby. It was so sweet to press the living toy to her breast, and feel that a human being existed who did owe, and was to owe everything to her, whose daily food was drawn from herself, whose little wants could all be satisfied by her, whose little heart would first love her and her only, whose infant tongue would make its first effort in calling her by the sweetest name a woman can hear. And so Eleanor's bosom became tranquil, and she set about her new duties eagerly and gratefully. As regards the concerns of the world, John Bold had left his widow in prosperous circumstances. He had bequeathed to her all that he possessed, and that comprised an income much exceeding what she or her friends thought necessary for her. It amounted to nearly 1,000 a year, and when she reflected on its extent, her dearest hope was to hand it over, not only unimpaired, but increased, to her husband's son, to her own little darling, the little man who now lay sleeping on her knee, happily ignorant of the cares which were to be accumulated in his behalf. When John Bold died, she earnestly implored her father to come and live with her, but this Mr. Harding declined, though for some weeks he remained with her as a visitor. He could not be prevailed upon to forego the possession of some small home of his own, and so remained in the lodgings he had first selected, over a chemist's shop in the High Street of Barchester. And that is where we shall take a break. Thank you for listening so far. I hope you're enjoying. We shall throw to a break. Go do break-related things, and we shall be back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. welcome back. I hope everybody has had a good break. Oh, I moved my microphone, didn't I? Let's move that back, one sec. Also, welcome back, welcome in, Angeline. Thank you very much for the resubscription. 20 months of story time, yeah. Your job is being annoying today? Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. I hope your job stops being annoying. But yeah. I am... Oh, excuse me. Not gonna lie, I'm flagging slightly. My neck is hurting a bit, and I'm feeling rather tired. So we'll see how much more we get through tonight. But yeah, hope you're enjoying so far. It is very Sam's making dad jokes. Yes, I realise this is very, very UK centric. This there's, you know, stuff about dioceses and bishoprics and things like that. It's like, welcome to the ecclesiastical world of, you know, cathedral and church stuff in the UK at this particular time. So yes, it gets a little bit less like that from here on in. It's more sort of setting things up. But yes, it was Omicron and whatever the other one was, Lambda. Yeah, the excellent doctor names, which I did approve of. I think they're rather good. But yes, shall we continue? I think we should continue with Chapter 3. Dr. and Mrs. Proudie. This narrative is supposed to commence immediately after the installation of Dr. Proudie. I will not describe the ceremony, as I do not precisely understand its nature. I am ignorant whether a bishop be chaired like a member of Parliament, or carried in a gilt coach like a Lord Mayor, or sworn in like a Justice of Peace, or introduced like a peer to the upper house, or led between two brethren like a Knight of the Garter, but I do know that everything was properly done, and that nothing fit or becoming to a young bishop was omitted on the occasion. Dr. Proudie was not the man to allow anything to be omitted that might be becoming to his new dignity. He understood well the value of forms, and knew that the due observance of rank could not be maintained unless the exterior trappings belonging to it were held in proper esteem. He was a man born to move in high circles, at least he thought so himself, and circumstances had certainly sustained him in this view. He was the nephew of an Irish baron by his mother's side, and his wife was the niece of a Scotch earl. He had for years held some clerical office appertaining to courtly matters, which had enabled him to live in London, and to entrust his parish to his curate. He had been preacher to the royal beefeaters, curator of theological manuscripts in the ecclesiastical courts, chaplain to the Queen's Yeomanry Guard, and almoner to His Royal Highness the Prince of Rappe-Blankenburg. His residence in the metropolis, rendered necessary by the duties thus entrusted to him, his high connections, and the peculiar talents and nature of the man, recommended him to persons in power, and Dr. Proudie became known as a useful and rising clergyman. Some few years since, even within the memory of many who are not yet willing to call themselves old, a liberal clergyman was a person not frequently to be met. Sidney Smith was such, and was looked on as little better than an infidel. A few others also might be named, but they were rara aves, and were regarded with doubt and distrust by their brethren. No man was so surely a Tory as a country rector. Nowhere were the powers that be so cherished as at Oxford. When, however, Dr. Whately was made an archbishop, and Dr. Hampden some years afterwards Regius Professor, Many wise divines saw that a change was taking place in men's minds, and that more liberal ideas would henceforward be suitable to the priests as well as to the laity. Clergymen began to be heard of who had ceased to anathematise papists on the one hand, or vilify dissenters on the other. It appeared clear that high church principles, as they are called, were no longer to be surest claims to promotion with at any rate one section of statesmen, and Dr. Proudie was one among those who early in life adapted himself to the views held by the Whigs on most theological and religious subjects. He bore with the idolatry of Rome, tolerated even the infidelity of Socianism, and was hand in glove with the Presbyterian synods of Scotland and Ulster. Such a man at such a time was found to be useful, and Dr. Proudie's name began to appear in the newspapers. He was made one of a commission who went over to Ireland to arrange matters preparative to the working of the National Board. He became honorary secretary to another commission nominated to inquire into the revenues of cathedral chapters, and had something to do with both the Regium Donum and the Maynooth Grant. It must not on this account be taken as proved that Dr. Proudie was a man of great mental powers, or even of much capacity for business, for such qualities had not been required in him. In the arrangement of those church reforms with which he was connected, the ideas and original conception of the work to be done were generally furnished by the liberal statesmen of the day, and the labour of the details was borne by officials of a lower rank. It was, however, thought expedient that the name of some clergyman should appear in such matters, and as Dr. Proudie had become known as a tolerating divine, great use of this sort was made of his name. If he did not do much active good, he never did any harm. He was amenable to those who were really in authority, and at the sittings of the various boards to which he belonged, maintained a kind of dignity which had its value. He was certainly possessed of sufficient tact to answer the purpose for which he was required without making himself troublesome, but it must not therefore be surmised that he doubted his own power, or failed to believe that he could himself take a high part in high affairs when his own turn came. He was biding his time, and patiently looking forward to the days when he himself would sit authoritative at some board, and talk and direct, and rule the roost, while lesser stars sat round and obeyed, as he had so well accustomed himself to do. His reward and his time had now come. He was selected for the vacant bishopric, and on the next vacancy which might occur in any diocese would take his place in the House of Lords, prepared to give not a silent vote in all matters concerning the weal of the church establishment. Toleration was to be the basis on which he was to fight his battles, and in the honest courage of his heart he thought no evil would come to him in encountering even such foes as his brethren of Exeter and Oxford. Dr. Proudie was an ambitious man, and before he was well consecrated Bishop of Barchester, he had begun to look up to archiepiscopal splendour, and the glories of Lambeth, or at any rate of Bishopthorpe. He was comparatively young, and had, as he fondly flattered himself, been selected as possessing such gifts, natural and acquired, as must be sure to recommend him to a yet higher notice, now that a higher sphere was opened to him. Dr. Proudie was, therefore, quite prepared to take a conspicuous part in all theological affairs appertaining to these realms, and having such views, by no means intended to bury himself at Barchester as his predecessor had done. No, London should still be his ground. A comfortable mansion in a provincial city might be well enough for the dead months of the year. Indeed, Dr. Proudie had always felt it necessary to his position to retire from London when other great and fashionable people did so, but London should still be his fixed residence. and it was in London that he resolved to exercise that hospitality so peculiarly recommended to all bishops by St. Paul. How otherwise could he keep himself before the world? How else give to the government in matters theological the full benefit of his weight and talents? The resolution was no doubt a salutary one as regarded the world at large, but was not likely to make him popular either with the clergy or people of Barchester. Dr. Grantley had always lived there, and in truth it was hard for a bishop to be popular after Dr. Grantley. His income had averaged £9,000 a year. His successor was to be rigidly limited to £5,000. He had but one child on whom to spend his money. Dr. Prudy had 7 or 8. He had been a man of few personal expenses, and they had been confined to the tastes of a moderate gentleman, but Dr. Prudy had to maintain a position in fashionable society, and had that to do with comparatively small means. Dr. Grantley had certainly kept his carriage as became a bishop, but his carriage, horses, and coachman, though they did very well for Barchester, would have been almost ridiculous at Westminster. Mrs. Prudy determined that her husband's equipage should not shame her, and things on which Mrs. Prudy resolved were generally accomplished. From all this it was likely to result that Dr. Prudy would not spend much money at Barchester, whereas his predecessor had dealt with the tradesmen of the city in a matter very much to their satisfaction. The Grantleys, father and son, had spent their money like gentlemen, but it soon became whispered in Barchester that Dr. Prudy was not unacquainted with those prudent devices by which the utmost show of wealth is produced from limited means. In person, Dr. Prudy is a good-looking man, spruce and dapper, and very tidy. He is somewhat below middle height, being about 5'4", but he makes up for the inches which he wants by the dignity with which he carries those which he has. It is no fault of his own if he has not a commanding eye, for he studies hard to assume it. His features are well formed. Though perhaps the sharpness of his nose may give to his face in the eyes of some people an air of insignificance. If so, it is greatly redeemed by his mouth and chin, of which he is justly proud. Dr. Prudy may well be said to have been a fortunate man, for he was not born to wealth, and he is now Bishop of Barchester. But nevertheless he has his cares. He has a large family, of whom the 3 eldest are daughters, now all grown up and fit for fashionable life, and he has a wife. It is not my intention to breathe a word against the character of Mrs. Prudy, but still I cannot think that with all her virtues she adds much to her husband's happiness. The truth is, that in matters domestic she rules supreme over her titular lord, and rules with a rod of iron. Nor is this all. Things domestic Dr. Prudy might have abandoned to her, if not voluntarily, yet willingly. But Mrs. Prudy is not satisfied with such home dominion, and stretches her power over all his movements, and will not even abstain from things spiritual. In fact, the bishop is henpecked. The archdeacon's wife, in her happy home at Plumstead, knows how to assume the full privileges of her rank, and express her own mind in becoming tone and place. But Mrs. Grantley's sway, if sway she has, is easy and beneficent. She never shames her husband. Before the world she is a pattern of obedience. Her voice is never loud, nor her looks sharp. Doubtless she values power, and has not unsuccessfully striven to acquire it, but she knows what should be the limits of a woman's rule. Not so Mrs. Prudy. This lady is habitually authoritative to all, but to her poor husband she is despotic. Successful as has been his career in the eyes of the world, it would seem that in the eyes of his wife he is never right. All hope of defending himself has long passed from him. Indeed, he rarely even attempts self-justification, and is aware that submission produces the nearest approach to peace which his own house can ever attain. Mrs. Proudie has not been able to sit at the boards and committees to which her husband has been called by the state, nor, as he often reflects, can she make her voice heard in the House of Lords. It may be that she will refuse to him permission to attend to this branch of a bishop's duties. It may be that she will insist on his close attendance to his own closet. He has never whispered a word on the subject to living ears, but he has already made his fixed resolve. Should such an attempt be made, he will rebel. Dogs have turned against their masters, and even Neapolitans against their rulers, when oppression has been too severe. And Dr. Proudie feels within himself that if the cord be drawn too tight, he also can muster courage and resist. The state of vassalage in which our bishop has been kept by his wife has not tended to exalt his character in the eyes of his daughters, who assume in addressing their father too much of that authority which is not properly belonging, at any rate, to them. They are, on the whole, fine, engaging young ladies. They are tall and robust like their mother, whose high cheekbones and, we may say, auburn hair they all inherit. They think somewhat too much of their grand uncles, who have not hitherto returned the compliment by thinking much of them. But now that their father is a bishop, it is probable that family ties will be drawn closer. Considering their connection with the Church, they entertain but few prejudices against the pleasures of the world, and have certainly not distressed their parents, as too many English girls have lately done, by an enthusiastic wish to devote themselves to the seclusion of a Protestant nunnery. Dr. Proudie's sons are still at school. One other marked peculiarity in the character of the bishop's wife must be mentioned. Though not averse to the society and manners of the world, she is in her own way a religious woman, and the form in which this tendency shows itself in her is by strict observance of Sabbatarian rule. Dissipation and low dresses during the week are, under her control, atoned for by 3 services, an evening sermon read by herself, and a perfect abstinence from any cheering employment on the Sunday. Unfortunately for those under her roof to whom the dissipation and low dresses are not extended, her servants, namely, and her husband, the compensating strictness of the Sabbath includes all. Woe betide the recreant housemaid who is found to have been listening to the honey of a sweetheart in the Regent's Park, instead of the soul-stirring evening discourse of Mr. Slope. Not only is she sent adrift, but she is so sent with a character which leaves her little hope of a decent place. Woe betide the 6-foot hero who escorts Mrs. Proudie to her pew in red plush breeches, if he slips away to the neighbouring beer shop instead of falling into the back seat appropriated to his use. Mrs. Proudie has the eyes of Argus for such offenders. Occasional drunkenness in the week may be overlooked, for 6 feet on low wages are hardly to be procured if the morals are always kept at a high pitch, but not even for grandeur or economy will Mrs. Proudie forgive a desecration of the Sabbath. In such matters Mrs. Proudie allows herself to be often guided by that eloquent preacher, the Reverend Mr. Slope, and as Dr. Proudie is guided by his wife, it necessarily follows that the eminent man we have named has obtained a good deal of control over Dr. Proudie in matters concerning religion. Mr. Slope's only preferment has hitherto been that of reader and preacher in a London district church, and on the consecration of his friend, the new bishop, he readily gave this up to undertake the onerous but congenial duties of domestic chaplain to his lordship. Mr. Slope, however, on his first introduction, must not be brought before the public at the tail of a chapter. Chapter 4. The Bishop's Chaplain. Of the Reverend Mr. Slope's parentage I am not able to say much. I have heard it asserted that he is lineally descended from that eminent physician who assisted at the birth of Mr. T. Shandy, and that in early years he added an E to his name for the sake of euphony, as other great men have done before him. If this be so, I presume he was christened Obadiah, for that is his name, in commemoration of the conflict in which his ancestor so distinguished himself. All my researches on the subject have, however, failed in enabling me to fix the date on which the family changed its religion. He had been a sizar at Cambridge, and had there conducted himself at any rate successfully, for in due process of his time he was an M.A., having university pupils under his care. From thence he was transferred to London, and became preacher at a new district church built on the confines of Baker Street. He was in this position when congenial ideas on religious subjects recommended him to Mrs. Proudie, and the intercourse had become close and confidential. Having been thus familiarly thrown among the Misses Proudie, it was no more than natural that some softer feeling than friendship should be engendered. There have been some passages of love between him and the eldest hope, Olivia, but they have hitherto resulted in no favourable arrangement. In truth, Mr. Slope, having made a declaration of affection, afterwards withdrew it on finding that the doctor had no immediate worldly funds with which to endow his child, and it may easily be conceived that Miss Proudie, after such an announcement on his part, was not readily disposed to receive any further show of affection. On the appointment of Dr. Proudie to the bishopric of Barchester, Mr. Slope's views were, in truth, somewhat altered. Bishops, even though they be poor, can provide for clerical children, and Mr. Slope began to regret that he had not been more disinterested. He no sooner heard the tidings of the doctor's elevation than he recommenced his siege, not violently indeed, but respectfully, and at a distance. Olivia Proudie, however, was a generous spirit, and she had the blood of 2 peers in her veins, and better still, she had another lover on her books. So Mr. Slope sighed in vain, and the pair soon found it convenient to establish a mutual bond of inveterate hatred. It may be thought singular that Mrs. Proudie's friendship for the young clergyman should remain firm after such an affair, but, to tell the truth, she had known nothing of it. Though very fond of Mr. Slope herself, she had never conceived the idea that either of her daughters would become so, and remembering their high birth and social advantages, expected for them matches of a different sort. Neither the gentleman nor the lady found it necessary to enlighten her. Olivia's 2 sisters had each known of the affair, so had all the servants, so had all the people living in the adjoining houses on either side, but Mrs. Proudie had been kept in the dark. Mr. Slope soon comforted himself with the reflection that, as he had been selected as chaplain to the bishop, it would probably be in his power to get the good things in the bishop's gift without troubling himself with the bishop's daughter, and he found himself able to endure the pangs of rejected love. As he sat himself down in the railway carriage, confronting the bishop and Mrs. Proudie as they started on their first journey to Barchester, he began to form in his own mind a plan of his future life. He knew well his patron's strong points, but he knew the weak ones as well. He understood correctly enough to what attempts the new bishop's high spirit would soar, and he rightly guessed that public life would better suit the great man's taste than the small details of diocesan duty. He, therefore, Mr. Slope, would in effect be Bishop of Barchester. Such was his resolve, and to give Mr. Slope his due, he had both courage and spirit to bear him out in his resolution. He knew that he should have a hard battle to fight, for the power and patronage of the see would be equally coveted by another great mind. Mrs. Proudie would also choose to be Bishop of Barchester. Mr. Slope, however, flattered himself that he could outmanoeuvre the lady. She must live much in London, while he would always be on the spot. She would necessarily remain ignorant of much, while he would know everything belonging to the diocese. At first, doubtless, he must flatter and cajole, perhaps yield in some things, but he did not doubt of ultimate triumph. If all other means failed, he could join the bishop against his wife, inspire courage into the unhappy man, lay an axe to the root of the woman's power, and emancipate the husband. Such were his thoughts as he sat looking at the sleeping pair in the railway carriage, and Mr. Slope is not the man to trouble himself with such thoughts for nothing. He is possessed of more than average abilities, and is of good courage. Though he can stoop to fawn, and stoop low indeed if need be, he has still within him the power to assume the tyrant, and with the power he certainly has the wish. His acquirements are not of the highest order, but such as they are completely under control, and he knows the use of them. He is gifted with a certain kind of pulpit eloquence, not likely indeed to be persuasive with men, but powerful with the softer sex. In his sermons he deals greatly in denunciation, excites the minds of his weaker hearers with a not unpleasant terror, and leaves an impression on their minds that all mankind are in a perilous state, and all womankind too, except those who attend regularly to the evening lectures in Baker Street. His looks and tones are extremely severe, so much so that one cannot but fancy that he regards the greater part of the world as being infinitely too bad for his care. As he walks through the streets, his very face denotes his horror of the world's wickedness, and there is always an anathema lurking in the corner of his eye. In doctrine, he, like his patron, is tolerant of dissent, if so strict a mind can be called tolerant of anything. With Wesleyan Methodists he has something in common, but his soul trembles in agony at the iniquities of the Pusyites. His aversion is carried to things outward as well as inward. His gall rises at a new church with a high-pitched roof. A full-breasted black silk waistcoat is with him a symbol of Satan, and a profane jest-book would not, in his view, more foully desecrate the church seat of a Christian than a book of prayer printed with red letters and ornamented with a cross on the back. Most active clergymen have their hobby, and Sunday observances are his. Sunday, however, is a word which never pollutes his mouth. It is always the Sabbath. The desecration of the Sabbath, as he delights to call it, is to him meat and drink. He thrives upon that as policemen do on the general evil habits of the community. It is the loved subject of all his evening discourses, the source of all his eloquence, the secret of all his power over the female heart. To him the revelation of God appears only in that one law given for Jewish observance. To him the mercies of our Saviour speak in vain. To him in vain has been preached that sermon which fell from divine lips on the mountain, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." To him the New Testament is comparatively of little moment, for from it can he draw no fresh authority for that dominion which he loves to exercise over at least a seventh part of man's allotted time here below. Mr. Slope is tall and not ill-made. His feet and hands are large, and as has ever been the case with all his family, but he has a broad chest and wide shoulders to carry off these excrescences, and on the whole his figure is good. His countenance, however, is not specially prepossessing. His hair is lank and of a dull, pale, reddish hue. It is always formed into 3 straight, lumpy masses, each brushed with admirable precision and cemented with much grease. 2 of them adhere closely to the sides of his face, and the other lies at right angles above them. He wears no whiskers, and is always punctiliously shaven. His face is nearly of the same colour as his hair, though perhaps a little redder. It is not unlike beef. Beef, however, one would say, of a bad quality. His forehead is capacious and high, but square and heavy, and unpleasantly shining. His mouth is large, though his lips are thin and bloodless, and his big, prominent, pale brown eyes inspire anything but confidence. His nose, however, is his redeeming feature. It is pronounced, straight, and well formed, though I myself should have liked it better did it not possess a somewhat spongy, porous appearance, as though it had been cleverly formed out of a red-coloured cork. I never could endure to shake hands with Mr. Slope. A cold, clammy perspiration always exudes from him. The small drops are ever to be seen standing on his brow, and his friendly grasp is unpleasant. Such is Mr. Slope. Such is the man who has suddenly fallen into the midst of Barchester Close, and is destined there to assume the station which has heretofore been filled by the son of the late bishop. Think, O my meditative reader, what an associate we have here for those comfortable prebendaries, those gentleman-like clerical doctors, whose happy, well-used, well-fed minor canons, who have grown into existence at Barchester under the kindly wings of Bishop Grantley. But not as a mere associate for these does Mr. Slope travel down to Barchester with the bishop and his wife. He intends to be, if not their master, at least the chief among them. He intends to lead and to have followers. He intends to hold the purse strings of the diocese, and draw round him an obedient herd of his poor and hungry brethren. And here we can hardly fail to draw a comparison between the Archdeacon and our new private chaplain, and despite the manifold faults of the former, one can hardly fail to make it much to his advantage. Both men are eager, much too eager, to support and increase the power of their order. Both are anxious that the world should be priest-governed, though they have probably never confessed so much, even to themselves. Both begrudge any other kind of dominion held by man over man. Dr. Grantley, if he admits the Queen's supremacy in things spiritual, only admits it as being due to the quasi-priesthood conveyed in the consecrating qualities of her coronation, and he regards things temporal as being by their nature subject to those which are spiritual. Mr. Slope's ideas of sacerdotal rule are of quite a different class. He cares nothing one way or the other for the Queen's supremacy. These to his ears are empty words, meaning nothing. Forms he regards but little, and such titular expressions as supremacy, consecration, ordination, and the like convey of themselves no significance to him. Let him be supreme who can. The temporal king, judge, or master can work but on the body. The spiritual master, if he have the necessary gifts and can duly use them, has a wider field of empire. He works upon the soul. If he can make himself be believed, he can be all-powerful over those who listen. If he be careful to meddle with none who are too strong in intellect or too weak in flesh, he may indeed be supreme. And such was the ambition of Mr. Slope. Dr. Grantley interfered very little with the worldly doings of those who were in any way subject to him. I do not mean to say that he omitted to notice misconduct among his clergy, immorality in his parish, or omissions in his family, but he was not anxious to do so where the necessity could be avoided. He was not troubled with a propensity to be curious, and as long as those around him were tainted with no heretical leaning towards dissent, as long as they fully and freely admitted the efficacy of Mother Church, he was willing that Mother should be merciful and affectionate, prone to indulgence and unwilling to chastise. He himself enjoyed the good things of this world, and liked to let it be known that he did so. He cordially despised any brother rector who thought harm of dinner parties, or dreaded the dangers of a moderate claret jug. Consequently, dinner parties and claret jugs were common in the diocese. He liked to give laws and to be obeyed in them implicitly, but he endeavoured that his ordinances should be within the compass of the man, and not unpalatable to the gentleman. He had ruled among his clerical neighbours now for sundry years, and as he had maintained his power without becoming unpopular, it may be presumed that he had exercised some wisdom. Of Mr. Slope's conduct much cannot be said, as his grand career is yet to commence, but it may be premised that his tastes will be very different from those of the Archdeacon. He conceives it to be his duty to know all the private doings and desires of the flock entrusted to his care. From the poorer classes he exacts an unconditional obedience to set rules of conduct, and if disobeyed he has recourse, like his great ancestor, to the fulminations of an Anulphus. Thou shalt be damned in thy going in and in thy coming out, in thy eating and thy drinking, etc., etc., etc. With the rich, experience has already taught him that a different line of action is necessary. Men in the upper walks of life do not mind being cursed, and the woman, presuming that it be done in delicate phrase, rather like it. But he has not, therefore, given up so important a portion of believing Christians. With the men, indeed, he is generally at variance. They are hardened sinners, on whom the voice of the priestly charmer too often falls in vain. But with the ladies, old and young, firm and frail, devout and dissipated, he is, as he conceives, all-powerful. He can reprove faults with so much flattery, and utter censure in so caressing a manner, that the female heart, if it glow with a spark of low church susceptibility, cannot withstand him. In many houses he is thus an admired guest. The husbands, for their wives' sake, are fain to admit him, and when once admitted, it is not easy to shake him off. He has, however, a pouring, greasy way with him, which does not endear him to those who do not value him for their soul's sake, and he is not a man to make himself at once popular in a large circle such as is now likely to surround him at Barchester. And I think there is where we shall finish for tonight. Thank you for listening. Obadiah Slope. Great guy. But yes. Break. But I'm finishing. I've already done a break. And yes, our RKS Biblical. Words are hard. Oh, excuse me. Lots of long words in this. Oh, you're trolling. Okay, right. Okay. Right. Well, I'm very, very tired. So I don't think I'll raid. But in theory, Sam will be back on Saturday for some short stories of some description. And yeah, hopefully we'll be back on next Monday as well, because we haven't done a Chilitra tea stream this month. So yeah, might be good to do that, but we shall see. But yes, thank you all very much for being here. Go take care of yourselves, and we shall hopefully see you. We will see you on Saturday. Thank you all very much, and goodbye.